Greetings, I'm Squared here. Today we are going to talk about solving a quadratic equation by completing the square. We're only going to do those for the quadratic equations where a is equal to 1. And then the next video we'll talk about a being equal to 2. I mean, bigger than 1. So we want to remember, kind of going into this, what a perfect trinomial square is. So if you see this trinomial right here, we have ax squared plus 2ab plus b. It didn't look kind of like that when we factored it. It would look something like x squared plus, let's see, if I had a 16 over here, then that would be 4 squared. So see how the a and the b are squared. And then if you took the square root of both of those, so the square root of this is x, the square root of this is 4, and you multiply them together, that's a times b, and then you doubled them, so that would have been 8x. So it looks something like that, where these are both perfect squares, the quadratic term and the constant term, and the middle term is the square root of both of those doubled, multiplied together and doubled. The reason why that's important is because we're going to change our equations into, part of it's going to be a trinomial square, so we have to change it, so we have to know how to do that. And then we're going to factor it, which the trinomial square always factored into this beautiful little binomial quantity squared. So just a reminder how that works. If this was a plus, then this was a plus when you factored it. If this was a subtraction sign, then you had a subtraction sign here. Okay, so we're going to just, at the beginning, we're just going to say, hey, what would C be to make this a trinomial square? Because that's pretty much the first step in solving by completing the square. So how we do that is we take half of b, because remember up here in our formula it was multiplied by 2, so we're undoing that multiplied by 2 and we're dividing by 2. So half of b, or divide 26 or b by 2, is 13. And then we're going to square it, because c is half of b. That means half of b squared. So if I want to find c to make it a trinomial square, it doesn't mean that it's always that way. I'm just saying if you're making it a perfect trinomial square, you're going to put it there. So we're going to take half of b and square it. So when we do that, we get 169. And so that would, now that's the only answer right here. But if you wanted to factor it from that, remember, then we get this nice pretty little factor that goes like this. Remember, so it's the square root of this here, the square root of that here, and then the plus or minus sign, whichever it is, in the middle. Okay, so we're going to try this one. So what's half of b? Negative 18 there. So half of b is a 9, negative 9, but when I square it, I get 81. So c equals 81. And then, of course, you could factor it nice and pretty. You could get x minus 9 quantity squared. All right, you can see that. Okay, so here are the steps to completing the square. There's quite a few of them. We got to remember how to complete the square. So what we're going to do is, we are going to, you got to memorize these steps, but we're going to kind of go through it step by step. So this first step is to move c to the right side. The second step is to make sure that a equals negative 1. Remember, today we're just doing a equals 1, so we won't have to worry about that step today. That'll be the next video. We're going to take half of b, find half of b squared and add it to both sides. Then we're going to factor the left side. It's going to be that nice, pretty trinomial square pattern. It's always going to look like this. Half of b is going to go inside. And then we're going to take the square root of both sides. We're going to remember that when we take the square root of both sides, remember we talked about that last time, if x squared equals 25, and we take the square root of both sides, there are 2 answers. There's a positive 5 answer and a negative 5 answer. Those were like the easy ones. Today it's going to be a little more complicated because we're going to have adding or subtracting along with that. So just remember this plus or minus, and then we solve. That means the last step is to get x alone. Okay, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this one so you can see what I'm doing. So the first step, I'm going to cover up those steps, but if you want to write them down, or get them in your brain. Okay, so we're going to take half. We're going to add c to both sides. So it was negative 96. I'm going to add 96 to both sides. And when I do that, I leave a little gap right here because I know that I'm going to soon add something to both sides, and I want to add the c right there to make that perfect trinomial square. So I'm going to take half of b, which is half of 10, which is 5, square it, which is 25, and I'm going to add it to both sides. And then I'm going to factor the left side. That's the next step. So I always know it's going to be a binomial squared, and the square root of this and the square root of that and whatever sign this is. So this number will always be half of that or the square root of that in a trinomial square. That's what will happen. And the whole reason I added 25, I could have added anything I wanted, but the whole reason I added 25 was because I needed to make this a perfect trinomial square. The reason I add 25 to both sides is to balance out the equation. So that's 121. So now the next step after I factor the left side is to take the square root of both sides. And when I do that, remember, the square and the square root, there's like a little 2 there, they cancel each other out. So anything squared, square rooted, it's just whatever that is. So for example, the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 25, which is 5 squared, is just 5. So that's the rule that we're working with there. You got to remember when you take the square root of both sides, you get a plus or a minus, and the square root of 121 is 11. And so now our last step is to solve. So that means I need to get x alone. So I'm going to subtract 5. So I like to write it with the number first and not the plus or minus. So I'm going, but it doesn't really matter. If you understand the plus or minus, you're good. So plus or minus means that one time I add 11 to the negative 5, and the other time I subtract 11. So I have 2 answers there. So negative 5 plus 11 is 6, and negative 5 minus 11 is negative 16. So these are my x values that make this equation true. They're also my x-intercepts, if you remember how we did that when we graphed it. Okay, one more. So normally in class I would say it's your turn, so if you want to pause and try to do it, you can. I'm just going to go for it a little bit faster now. So first step is add 21 to both sides. So x squared plus 4x, leave a little space because I'm going to add something in there, equals 21. Then I'm going to take half of b, which is 2, square it, which is 4, and I'm going to add that to both sides. And I'm going to factor this side, and the factor is always the square root of that and half of that, or the square root of that. Now I'm going to square root both sides, so I get x plus 2 is equal to positive or negative 5. And when I subtract 2 from both sides, I get x equals negative 2 plus or minus 5. So that means negative 2 plus 5, which is 3, or negative 2 minus 5, which is negative 7. And these are my answers. So those both, when I square rooted them, turned out to have a perfect square on the right side. So now we're going to do a couple that don't do that. And so we're going to have to use our calculators for these. So we'll get my calculator out. Okay, but the same steps. I'm going to subtract 14 from both sides. And I'll leave a little gap when I write it down. Then I'm going to take half of b, which is 10, square it. It's negative 10, but when I square it, I get a positive. So, negative 10 squared, if you put it like that in your calculator, sorry, you can't see that. With negative 10, that's going to equal 100. The mistake some people make, they put this in their calculator, and some calculators will give you a negative 100. So just make sure you know that negative 10 squared means negative 10 times negative 10, and the negative times the negative is positive. So that's 100. So now I'm going to factor this side, and over here I get 86. So I get x minus 10 when I factor that. X minus 10 times x minus 10. I had some questions that somebody said, well, where did the 20 go? So just in case you were wondering, where did the 20 go? Let me show you what x minus 10 squared is. X minus 10 squared is x minus 10 times x minus 10. So when we do our first distributive property kind of going on twice here, and then I get a negative 10x, and then another negative 10x, and then a positive 100. So the negative 20 is right there when I combine those like terms, and the 100 is there. So some people get confused when they see this. They say, hey, where'd the negative 20 go? That's where it went. So we're going to square root both sides. Then we're going to get x minus, okay, because that's a negative, minus 10 equals plus or minus the square root of 86. So we're going to add 10 to both sides, and I'm going to rewrite that with the 10 first, the thing I added over. And then I'm going to show you how to do that in your calculator. So this is the kind of calculator I like. So I'm going to say 10 plus. I'm going to use plus the first time. Then I'll show you how to quickly use the backspace to get the minus answer. So this is 10 plus the square root of 86. That's one of my answers. I'm going to round to the nearest tenths, which is the first place after the decimal. The 7 tells me to round that 2 up to a 3. So I'm going to say 19.3. And then The other answer, so I'm going to say x is approximately equal to, is with the minus sign. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to arrow over, and I'm going to change my plus sign. So I just use the backspace, and I'm going to change it to a minus sign. And then without having to write the whole thing in again, I have my answer, which is 0.7. 0.7. Okay, let's try this one. So again, if you want to pause and try it on your own, see if you can get it. Follow the steps. But I'm going to just do that now. So I'm going to subtract 27 from both sides. So I get x squared minus 16x, leave a little space, equals negative 27. Oops, it should be nice if I actually put negative 27 down. So a lot of people remember, oh, I can't have a negative when I'm square rooting. That's true, but we don't know if we're actually going to get a negative yet. So we have to take half of 16, negative 16, which is negative 8, and squared is 64. So see how when I add a positive number to that, it's going to, 64 is bigger than 27, so it's going to be positive. And if it was negative, though, at this point, you know it was a no solution because you can't square root a negative number, but always double check. So we're going to factor now x minus 8, square root of that, square root of that, equals, and I believe that's 37. When I square root both sides, I get x minus 8 equals plus or minus the square root of 37. And when I rewrite that, I get x equals, if I add 8 to both sides, 8, because it was positive, plus or minus the square root of 37. So again, in my calculator, I'm going to say 8 plus the square root of 37. And I get 14.08. The 8 tells me to move it up to 1, so I get 14.1. Or, and then the quick way, backspace, just use my arrow keys here and change my plus to a minus, and I get 1.9. So x is approximately equal to 14.1 or 1.9. You can always throw that number back in right here and see if it works. And if you estimate it, like if you put 1.9 in, it's not going to be exactly 0. So I'm going to show you that real quick. So 1.9 squared minus 16 times 1.9 plus 27. And I get 0.21. It's like 2/10. It's a little bit away from 0, but that's because it was an estimate. If you had put that square root back in, you would get the exact answer. All right, well, good luck with that. Make sure you memorize those formulas. I mean, the steps, not the formula. M squared, signing out.